Welcome and greetings to all of you. I am Laurie Walensky, Director of the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education Center, and I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar entitled Farm and Farm Family Risk and Resiliency, Tools You Can Use with Farmers, Professionals, and Communities to Create Thriving Farms. This presentation was originally scheduled to be presented today, in fact, at the Extension Risk Management Education National Conference in Denver as one of the professional development sessions. And while we are not Rocky Mountain High in Colorado, the ERME directors and the team of colleagues who are presenting this webinar felt that this was a very timely topic and applicable in the current environment with social distancing, illnesses, low supplies, etc. The webinar will be recorded. It's actually being recorded now, and a link will be shared in the future for future viewing. So it's really a pleasure to see so many of you jumping on this webinar with relatively short notice. So thank you again. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Bonnie Braun is with the University of Maryland Extension. She holds the distinction of Professor Emeritus in the School of Public Health in the Department of Family Science. Bonnie is involved in the USDA Agriculture Study of Health, Rural Development, and Agriculture Project. Jesse Ketterman is with the University of Maryland Extension. He is an educator with a focus on financial health and insurance literacy. He is one of the educators in Maryland approved to teach Michigan State University Extension farm stress curriculums. Jesse is also an accredited financial counselor. And Maria Papitas is with the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension. She is an extension educator with a focus on financial and health insurance literacy. Maria is one of the educators in Delaware approved to teach the Michigan State University Extension farm stress curriculums. She is an accredited financial counselor and a financial fitness coach. These three professional educators have been involved in the developing and testing the Smart Choice Smart Youth Health Insurance educational programs and were instrumental in offering the Linking Farm Vitality and Health Forums in their respective states. So I will now, again, thank you for being on this webinar. I'm going to turn the program over to our presenters and they'll get started.
Laurie, thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Bonnie Braun. It was very encouraging to see you signing in and to see that so many states from such a distance has checked in with us today and that you all could take time to join us. We greatly appreciate that. We, of course, originally planned this to deal with the ordinary and sometimes extraordinary stresses that are experienced by farms and ranches and the farm and ranching population and communities across the United States in general. And now we find ourselves, Jesse, if you would move it forward to the map, please, with Lancaster farming. Now we find ourselves in the middle of a national, well, international actually, global crisis of coronavirus or COVID-19 that's interrupting our regularly scheduled programming. So we are doing, as Laurie said, this in lieu of the scheduled workshop, and frankly, maybe there's going to be more of you involved in this simply because we're doing this. As Laurie also said, the timing is important here because the coronavirus itself has added in a new crisis and a new stressor to those already being experienced by the agricultural population. Newspapers like Lancaster Farming are preempting planned articles to report on the impact of the coronavirus. Farm and ranching operations are rethinking and rerouting their product deliveries as restrictions prevent sales through what they've ordinarily done as outlets for their items. Some are increasing direct and or on-farm sales with an increasing consumer base. Some of those consumers had not previously been a part of their base. Some agricultural-based operations like distilleries are refocusing their resources to make sanitizers. Producers are learning the new rules and regulations and finding ways to operate and still protect the health of themselves, their farm workers, other people associated with the farm or the ranch, and their families. Some are facing an increasing labor shortage as people stay home or have to stay away because they are ill. And that labor shortage is contributing to an already short labor supply that many operations were experiencing. Some are facing the fact that they have children at home and the need for social distancing between the younger population, the middle-aged population, and the older generations, perhaps many of whom are all living on that farm or ranch. And all of this is on top of, as I said at the beginning, stressors and challenges that much of the farming and ranching population has experienced for the last 7 years. The extent to which COVID-19 is a threat or an opportunity will depend in part not only on the ability to manage risk, but on a resiliency mindset and accompanying protective and recovery traits. I believe that the truth of this statement will play itself out over the next several months and maybe years. Our goal today is to guide you through what we have come to call a risk and resilience approach so that you can make informed programming decisions about how to respond to the challenges facing farms and ranches and the farm and ranching population. Together, and you can move ahead, Jesse. Together, we will become acquainted with the Farm and Farm Family Risk and Resiliency Framework. We're going to tease you about that. You're going to see it mentioned several times before you finally see it. So stay alert because it'll finally show up. We're also helping you become acquainted with some associated logic models that we've created that integrate risk management and resilient outcomes. Secondly, together, we will explore tools to use with farm populations, professionals, and stakeholders. We can't explore those tools in the same way we would have if we'd have been in a room in Denver today, but you will get to see a number of them, and you can try them out on your own. Also, together, we will strengthen confidence, we hope, your confidence individually and collectively in using the tools to develop integrated programming approaches. And how are we going to do this? Well, Jesse, we're going to have an organizing framework that asks and answers 3 key questions. Those questions are what, or why, what, and how. You'll see those repeated over and over, like I told Maria, a little bit like a symphony, where they get introduced and then we come back around to that. So that organizing framework is how we will proceed today. And we're also going to use a few of our tools as reflection tools that you could also use with your audiences. And to start us off, Jesse is going to introduce us to the Resiliency Bingo game. Jesse?
Thank you, Bonnie. And so looking at the number of participants, I have to kind of adjust how we planned on doing this. But this is just an activity that we created, which is, again, intended to loosen up the audience, to warm up the audience. It's a bingo game. So if you were in a crowd of, say, 20 or, working with a group of 20 or 30 people, could be 10, whatever, this is an opportunity to start, to allow people to start to make connections. And so what you do with the bingo game, the way we set this up is we have 5 categories. We have some topics under farm risk management, mindfulness, health, resiliency, and family. And what you would do is walk around a room and find someone else that has that same thing. So if I was in the room, I'd look for someone maybe that, hey, do you have a farm business plan, or is there something on my farm risk management list that you could sign that you do? And so this allows you to kind of warm up your audience to start thinking about the importance of risk management, the importance of mindfulness, the importance of health, resiliency, and family. And so this is just kind of a startup activity. Many of you may have done, some form of bingo activity before, but this is just a tool that you can use to warm up your audience when you go out and start to present. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you. And you may have noticed that that was used with the Mid-Atlantic Women in Agricultural Culture at their conference that took place, just last month, right? I think so. Well, the first question then that we're going to raise is, why do we need a new way of thinking about how we support farms, their families, and their workers? Well, you might not have thought we needed a new way, but that's a conclusion that Maria and I drew. And we're going to share with you some of our rationale why we think a new way may be needed. And in part, it rests on the fact that for the last 7 years, farms and the farming population and the ranches and the ranching population have experienced increased stress and crisis. There's considerable evidence about that. I don't think anyone would deny that. We also know from a study of how the farm crisis was handled in the 1980s, and some of us lived through that period, that some of that handling, that response, particularly by our own people, was not necessarily systematic nor focused on the long term. It tended to be about the immediacy, which is very important and you have to deal with, but then failed to look at where are we going. And so again, you see continual cycles of crises arriving that are in the big environment. And finally, we have some new research that can help us build on both short and long-term responses to risk, and it can be done through resiliency. This little visual just came out this week from a group called New Stories, and they happen to use the word paradigm, thinking that there's been a period of an old paradigm, we're moving into a new period of a paradigm, and in this period, people are starting new things and they're reaching out to one another. This came out just before the COVID-19, and I think it actually represents, we're going to divide some of our history into before COVID-19 and after, and the green piece across there is a bridge from what was to what will be. And of course, we are in the period, if you thought of those as parentheses, we're in the period that we don't know how it's going to turn out. Is this going to be a womb for the development of new and different ways of thinking and doing, or is it going to be a tomb? But whatever it is, it's in flux, and that's what they were trying to show with that visual. Well, I just said long-term and short-term responses to risk, so let's take a look at a typology of risk that should be familiar to any who have been involved in risk management. This is frequently used. There are 5 major types of risk, and if I was teaching about these, I would be pausing at each one, but I just asked Jesse to just show you all of them. Many of you will be quite familiar with this list. Some of you will not be. The thing that we have learned in the last about year and a half is that often these risks are dealt with separately and perhaps dealt with in the short run. So not necessarily in an integrative way nor in a long run. And another thing that we have learned is that that 5th piece there, that human and personal risk, we're beginning to call it fundamental. The fundamental risk that needs to be addressed is often completely separated from what's going on with the farm and looking at the various risks of the farm and the people who are farming or the people who are ranching. And so one of the things we want to point out is the importance of bringing together the concepts from agriculture, finance, health, human development, sociology, community development, all that sort of thing in a risk framework. So this is the framework that we also are using and have used to put together our risk and resiliency work. Now, Maria is going to build on that and introduce how we are defining resilience and resiliency thinking, and hopefully that will get you thinking about how this way of thinking could be used in your programming. Maria?
Thank you, Bonnie. So what is resilience and resiliency thinking? One definition.
Maria?
Yeah.
We didn't hear you for a while, Maria. Would you just start over, please?
Sure. What is resilience and resiliency thinking? Resilience is really the ability to not only survive, but to thrive. And to remain strong, we must really stretch ourselves and spring forward. And we've found that as we ask individuals what resilience is and resiliency is, there's oftentimes some confusion and some inappropriate use of those words. So next slide, let's just talk a little bit more about what they are. So we need to really understand what these words mean so we can use them correctly. And when we talk about resilience, it's really about the current capital that we can draw upon to address change and stressful situations. So this might be our knowledge, it might be our energy, it might be our health, it might be that's from sort of an individual perspective. We're going to talk about it from a family and a farm perspective as we go forward. But it's really, what are those resources? Resiliency is a little bit different. Resiliency is about the processes that we can use that can help build that resilience. So this is like decision making and problem solving and those kinds of processes that really help us cultivate and use our resources. And then the third piece is resiliency thinking. And this may be a new term for some of you, but resiliency thinking is really that integrated approach to thinking about those interrelated relationships between and among the social environment, the economic dynamics, health and well-being of the farm operation, the farmer, the farm family, and even the communities. And so it's really connecting each of those different approaches or each of those different sets of resources and using good decision-making to become more resilient. So what I want to do now is just sort of review some of the theories that Bonnie and I reviewed as we were putting together this resource for you. And we did do an extensive literature review. And we found several theories that we wanted to share and kind of review today. And so this first one comes from Froma Walsh. And she has been researching individual and family resilience for over 30 years. So in this model, you can see there are three major factors that can impact resilience. Up in the right-hand corner is the notion of belief systems. The bottom right-hand corner is communication processes, and in the left-hand corner is organizational processes. And all of these kind of combine to help individuals and families address stressors over time. And so you can see the concentric circles. And what that's trying to illustrate is really that interconnectedness between each of those ecological levels. So I like this model because it really helps provide some concrete strategies for building resilience, like improving communication by being clear, by sharing feelings, and by problem solving. Or being organized by having plans that are flexible, that have built-in supports, and enhances the connectedness and utilizes social and community resources. And lastly, that piece up in the corner about establishing belief systems that make meaning, help create hope, and connecting people to something greater. What I also like about this model is that it really makes us think about what are these factors which would be on each of the model levels, whether that's the individual, the family, the community, and beyond. Because by building these skills at each of the levels, we're building systems that can manage change and adjust over time. Next slide. So roughly then, right, here are some of those resiliency traits for individuals, right? Connectedness to others and a higher power, flexibility of being able to access social and community resources, communication, problem-solving skills, being hopeful, having a positive outlook, being able to share feelings. Next slide. The next model really gets at kind of family resilience. And it was developed by Patterson, and it speaks to family adjustment and adaptation response theory, right? And it really focuses on those interactions of family members and on the outcomes that can result in resilience. So, and it integrates in that stress, right? And the stress, not only that might be hitting the family, but how the stress may hit individuals in the family differently. So key pieces in this model, nope, back up, Jesse. Key pieces in this model are the demands, the meanings, and the capabilities, right? And we often understand the demands, and many times we approach programming trying to prevent or mitigate those demands. What I like about this framework is it really points out the meanings that individuals have about situations, about their identity in the family and their worldview, as well as their capabilities or their resources, right? Or their control over those resources or their coping skills, and how well they can, use those skills and capabilities to make change. So, within the family, there are oftentimes different individuals who will look at the same demand, and many have different responses because of those meanings and capabilities. And because of those differences, they may come to different outcomes. And they may be different, because they aren't old enough to process information or because of previous dynamics within the family. But as family members react with their own behaviors, it impacts the family's demands and meanings and capabilities. This also illustrates that socio-ecological model well. And it shows that over time, it shows that as a crisis or event occurs, new meanings and demands and capabilities can be created to provide adaptation. And so there are places for us as educators to kind of really intervene as we think about how do we help people make meaning out of things? How do we improve their capabilities? And what are different strategies to face the demands? Okay, next slide. So some of the key resiliency traits or characteristics would include these items, right? Commitment, time together, respect, spirituality, connectedness, communication, and that cohesion. Okay, one more theory. So this one is a bit more dynamic in terms of the picture. And it was designed by Sharon Dainies, who many of you may know from Minnesota. And it is called the Sustainable Family Business Theory. And it really helps to articulate. It's a little hard to see, but on the top of this square, you'll see the word family. And on the bottom of the square, you see the word business. And it really begins to look at that integration between family and business. If you look at all the way to the left, you're seeing things like resources, structure, and constraints for both the family and the business. And when we think of many farm families, some of those, that social capital and resources are the same in the family as well as for the business. Some of the decision-making may be different, but how those resources are used, both within the family structure and the business structure, are going to impact each other. And so that's one of the really interesting pieces to this model that really helps us see the complexity between and the interrelatedness between the resources of the family and the business. I also like the achievement box, which is sort of on the right-hand side under the word family and above the word business. And again, it's talking about what are the achievements and or priorities that are happening in the family and in the business, and that balance between those different, whether it's the family or the business. And it really acknowledges the functional integrity and the human capital growth and the financial soundness, right? And the structural integrity are achievements both at the family level and at the business level. And certainly those achievements are going to impact the success of managing change and managing disruptions, both in the short term and the long term. So, okay, next slide. So here are some of those traits that we've kind of pulled out of that very kind of complex model. But these are some of the traits, the resiliency traits of farms, right? Being robust and having strength, being able to transform and adapt, having kind of functional integrity in terms of the ability of key functions of both the farm family and the farm in order to continue to move forward. Financial soundness, human capital, meaning sort of how do we develop both on the personal side, but also the business side, on the leadership side, the structural integrity of the farm enterprise, or that of even the physical structures on the farm, and then clear and frequent communications. So this list is really a nice summary of the kinds of characteristics of strong and resilient farms that, again, as educators, we are doing the kind of work that helps to build their resilience. So how can we help build resiliency and resiliency thinking? And so one of the things we've tried to do is develop activities that can help our audience build those abilities. And so some of these abilities include having the capacity to make realistic plans, helping them understand how reframing problems or threats can be turned into lessons or opportunities for change. Helping them be able to identify resources and use them effectively, seeking out new information and identifying those individuals or organizations who can really provide support. So one of the tools, and we can put a star next to this, this is a tool that we developed to help explore resiliency thinking and doing is this, I'm calling it kind of a placemat. And so it's a place where what is posed or visualized here is a place where people can identify what their ultimate goal is and or the challenge that they're facing. And that's in the gold and the red areas of this placemat. And then in the purple, green, and blue areas are a variety of questions. So in the purple area, we're talking about questions that get people to think about what are their belief systems, In the green area, we're asking them to think about their organizational processes and strategies. And in the blue area, think about some of their communication and problem-solving processes. And clearly, risk management strategies, right, are integrated into these areas. But this gets them to think a little bit broader than just what are some of those risk management strategies. The ultimate goal then is to get them to that pale yellow section on the bottom where they're coming up with some short-term steps towards their dreams or to address the challenge, and also helping to identify and who can help. So, so that is the placemat that can be used within workshops and programming efforts to really get people to think about how they might build some of their own resilience as it and or create solutions that are really based on resiliency thinking. So all families really have shared belief systems, organizational processes and strategies, and communication and problem-solving processes. It may look different for different families, and that's okay. I think it's about helping them understand what those are and how it influences their decision-making, but also their ability to be resilient. So now I am turning it over to Bonnie, who will take us on to our next question.
All right. Thank you, Maria. I just want to pause and say she covered a lot of things about theory. She only highlighted some of the many theories that we looked at. And we didn't just stick to family theories. We looked at theories from business and from agriculture. And one of you made a comment in the chat about looking at socio-ecological food systems theories. And indeed, we looked at some of that. We'll go back and probably look even more in what we think will be a second edition. There is a lot of literature, particularly coming out of other countries, more so than the United States. We had a gap in there for a long time in producing literature that dealt with this sort of an integrated approach. So Maria just shared with you a way that you could work folks through getting them thinking about some of the theory converted into practice. And now we're going to come back to answer the question of why a risk and resilience framework. We've been teasing you with this all along. We're going to keep talking about that before we show it to you. This search that we did over about an 18-month period was for a framework that could help any of us in Extension and many of our partners, existing or potential partners out in finance and health and other areas, to address the stressors and crises and the negative impacts most of them are having on the population and all on the farming operation itself. And we did ultimately, in looking at all of that, come to the conclusion that there's such a relationship between stress and risk, and then between risk and resilience, that we needed to come up with a framework where this all fit together, and that it was a very timely framework to develop because of the unprecedented challenges that farmers and ranchers and their families are experiencing, both up close and personal and around the world, and the changes that are occurring at an accelerated pace. We also believed that rather than a simple reaction, that we needed a research-informed action that could provide us a conceptual map about how to guide what could be prevention activities and mitigation. And of course, those two terms are being used a lot right now in relation to the COVID challenge. But what can you do to prevent something, and then what can you do to mitigate its effects? And again, resilience literature tells us something about both of those. And we wanted something to enable us to target our interventions in such a way that it was likely that we could help farmers and ranchers, their families, their greater communities, policymakers, produce the kind of change or continuity of current activities that would deal with these persistent stressors and crises and the ones yet to come into the future. So the risk and resilience framework that you're going to see here in a minute, which is very simple actually, but what it actually does is enable us to do many things. And this is a list of things that we've thought of. We imagine that if we had all of you in the room right now and we could open it up to a discussion, you might think about other things, and you may think about other things going forward. But the framework can provide us with a much more integrated, broader, holistic approach to our programming, put some perspective on risk so that we can make better decisions about how we're going to teach about it, and those that we're serving can actually make better decisions. It can keep us looking for the latest research, additional theories, how they all fit together, looking for and integrating best practices, not just from one disciplinary area, but from multiple disciplines, so that we're putting that together in an effective way. Because after all, individuals going through any sort of stressors or crises comes down to individuals making decisions, and they do what they know to do. And we also know that high stress impairs their people's ability to get new information, and without knowing and understanding something better, you may fall back on ways that you have done things. But taken together, a risk and resilience framework can help both build up protective factors when these things come, and recovery factors, how to get through it and come out on the other end. A second question that we move on to, Jesse, is the question of, well, what is the framework based on? And so we wanted to say right up front that we were greatly influenced by the document that came out 5 years ago titled Cooperative Extension's National Framework for Health and Wellness, that took a socio-ecological approach with the vision that Extension could do in the 21st century in the area of health and wellness what we did in the 21st for agriculture. And actually now what Maria and I are doing is pulling these together and saying you could use a socio-ecological framework to bring those sort of domains of life together. This is also built on a synthesis of 96 risk and resilience research articles from multiple disciplines. You can see the range of the types of disciplines that we looked at. I've already alluded to part were domestic, but many of them were from other countries. It also is built on a set of 6 change and or resilience theories. Maria introduced you to, I think it was 3 resilience theories, but we came up with some others. And 2 key change theories, one out of agriculture that I was introduced to years ago by Everett Rogers, the diffusion and adoption of innovation in agriculture. And then over in the health arena, once I was in a school of public health, I began to understand that public health also used a change theory. And both of these are relevant and need to be understood. We're not taking time to explain them on this webinar, but they are in the guidebook. We also believed that you can't put together a good response or even have a good framework if you don't have some validated risk and resilience assessment instruments. And so we dove very hard into trying to find validated instruments and found 9 that we'll introduce you to a bit more later in the webinar. And then we also know from our own personal experience with multiple years in extension that educators probably aren't going to respond even to a call like we're making to do something slightly differently, to think with a resiliency framework to your programming, if you don't have some actual tools. And I noticed already in the chat, there's some requests, well, can we get these tools? Oh, yes, you're going to be able to get these tools, and we'll be telling you how to do that near the end. So it produced what is up here now, the Farm and Farm Family Risk and Resilience Guide for Extension Educational Programming. We finally cut ourselves off in January of this year and said, we have to put this out. It's too timely to take any longer. And so we actually called it the first edition. And there is a website there. We can come back to that later. I'll also be putting it in the chat where you can click on it and download it. But the guidebook itself, we released right at the end of January, and this is a part of promoting that, is that it does exist. Use it. So what's in it? Well, let's go to the next slide to see that it's divided into 4 sections, and actually our webinar is dealing with each one of these sections. So the first section is why to use the risk and resiliency framework. It includes science and best practices and theories and strategies behind responses you might make, and risk and resilience theories. That's all contained in section 1. In section 2, there is, well, what outcomes could be achieved if you actually used a socio-ecological risk and resilience model. And we go so far as to offer you some logic models, which Jesse will explain in a bit. Section 3 is how can Extension and other professionals apply the research and theory and incorporate existing resources into current programming, make some slight modifications perhaps. And as we wrestled with that question, we began to realize as we looked for themes in the tools we were looking at and in the resilience and risk theories, that they kind of grouped themselves nicely into health and wellness, financial management, personal, family, and farm resilience development tools. So you are going to hear particularly from Maria about both assessment tools and educational teaching tools. And then finally we come to a section called, well, where do I start? We felt very strongly that if you did become convinced that this was an approach, you would say, I would do it, but I don't even know where to start. We almost felt that way when I was challenged by my dean to explain why are we seeing so many suicides among the farming population, which set us off on the path that actually has produced this now. And so where do I start? We will be addressing a little bit later. Next, you see here the actual framework itself, and I said it's relatively simple. You may very well be familiar with other socio-ecological models, and this would look rather familiar to you. It indicates that there are domains that are embedded inside other domains, and because each is a system, and they're all systems, they affect one another, and change in any one part affects change in other parts. It's been our tendency often to respond to education for the individual. If I can just get them to know something differently, maybe they'll behave differently. If I can just help them change an attitude, maybe they'll behave differently. And certainly we're seeing that playing itself out with the choices people are making about social distancing or not. But it's not enough to stop there. It's not enough to target the, quote, the farmer and the rancher. You've got to move on because they are each individually embedded in other social systems, such as the interpersonal system, where they're interpersonally relating to members of their near and distant family, their friends, their various social networks, whether they are physical social networks or electronic social networks. But there is that whole system playing itself out. What we did that makes ours different is that we found nowhere where the farm or the ranch was ever embedded as a system. And it is a system within systems. And the individuals and families are embedded in that when it's a farming business and often live on that farm. So, Jesse, go back, please. Jesse, thank you. So we added that component to this model. And then you see it embedded in the community, the organization, and the greater environment. Very clearly right now, with the COVID-19, we're seeing the play out of the system of policy, whether it's state, federal, or local, playing out on our organizations, communities, farms, our families, friends, and our individual farmers and ranchers. Now, moving ahead, Jesse was going to the next slide, which is directly tied to the Cooperative Extension National Framework for Health and Wellness. We kept the coloring scheme and we slightly modified it. So the targeted outcome, the ultimate outcome in this model is that we have resilient farms and resilient farming populations. And to get there, that's in white, to get there embedded in the dark blue are that we have healthy farming systems and that we have healthy farmers, farm families, and workers, or ranchers, ranch workers, and ranch families. Those are embedded in the model that showed that you have, on the one hand, you have to address choices that people make, and are they healthy and safe choices? And on the other hand, how healthy and safe are the environments in which these individuals and these farms are living and operating? The gold ring around there originally had 6 priority areas, and we have kept most of those and added a few more because we think they're all relevant to whether or not you could have resilient farms and resilient farming and ranching populations. We did nothing to change the outer ring, which is the light blue ring of extension partners. What we may see, though, is a more or less engagement with certain of these partners. And one of the things we've clearly learned from the forums that we've held to strengthen the vitality of farms and the health of the farming population is that we may need to be working much more closely with the healthcare system, and particularly with mental health. And we had people from those systems say to us, we don't know much about farmer systems and the farming population, so you could help us with that. So we anticipate that that will change. The next 2 visuals that Jesse will put up, one is our way of showing what we think is what currently is happening, that we have individualistic efforts pointed at the farm and or the ranch, and that we believe that this is important but inadequate, and that what we're really going to need, if we're going to approach this from a risk and resiliency approach, is an integrative approach, which we've tried to visualize here in this next slide, which rather than having the individual boxes pointing, we show it as circles all co-joined and overlapping each other and being supportive of the farmer and rancher and the farm and ranch family and the farm enterprise. So now we come to another question, and Jesse's going to ask and answer the next question. Jesse?
Thank you, Bonnie. So the next question we look at is, how do we integrate risk management and resilience strategy into our interventions and programming? And so when you kind of reviewed the literature, you kind of fell into 3 categories. One, you need to become knowledgeable about the science of risk and resilience. And then you need to be able to integrate a framework to plan, implement, evaluate, and communicate about individual and collective interventions and programs. And then you need to take advantage of existing assessment and educational tools. And then when there are gaps that do exist, then we need to create tools to fill those gaps. And intervention kind of ties into a term more used in the health field. So when you think about, we use the word programming and extension. In the health field, they talk about interventions. And so that's why you see interventions and programming combined. So let's get started with the logic models. I think we should all be somewhat familiar with logic models, but logic models help us identify outcomes and then tie those outcomes into inputs or resources. And then it also allows you to think about the delivery methods and who your audience will be for those different needs. And then you can also identify evaluation strategies at the onset of the program as opposed to just coming up with it after the fact. So it's really a thought process and a planning process as you conduct your programming. So what's it going to do specifically? It's going to help hone our problem or issue. It's going to help us identify who the key partners and resources are. It's going to help us in terms of developing program content and delivery methods, and making sure those things tie into the goals. And it's also going to create realistic programmatic timelines. And so, and then tie that whole piece into the evaluation component. And so the logic models that were developed kind of fall into 3 areas. So there's 3 different logic models. We're not going to walk through those logic models in detail today, but we're going to tell you a little bit about them. And then when you download the guide, which again, we're going to provide that link for you, you can really dig into those logic models. But the logic models, one is kind of looking at the professionals, and those professionals are the people that are supporting the farms and the farming population. So again, they can be agricultural professionals, finance professionals, family or health professionals. Again, it's those people that work with the farm and farm families. Then we have a logic model developed specifically for the farm families, and then also one that looks at the stakeholders. And so let's jump into talking a little bit about the logic model. Again, I'm not going into detail about these logic models because they are in the guidebook and you can kind of look through them and absorb them on your own. But we do look at what are the inputs. So we start with our situation statement. And so this is the logic model for farm and farm families. You look at the situation statement, develop your situation statement. Then you have that input. So what can impact that? And then what are your outputs? So then you're looking at activities and participation. In the process of that, then you develop your learning outcomes. And then you're looking at the assessment piece of behavior change. You have conditional outcomes, and then ultimate outcomes. So what are you striving for in the long term? So this is a framework for a logic model. And like I said, we've developed 3. They're in the guidebook. The next one is from a professional development perspective. And you'll be able to take any of these 3 logic models and use your own inputs, outputs, and learning outcomes and massage it to your particular situation. And then the third one is the stakeholder development. So again, the same thing. We've gathered all that information for you and pulled it into the guidebook.
Thank you, Jesse. Hope that you all find that to be very helpful. Those were all peer reviewed by people in evaluation, county educators in agriculture, family, and others. And the reason there are 3 is that we think you have 3 very distinct audiences there that you might work with. We keep talking about working with the farm and ranchers and their families, but there's also folks like you today. We're operating off our logic model as we put together this professional development opportunity. And then there are the stakeholders, the people who are making decisions that you might want to do programming for. The next question that I'm charged with having to answer is why a farm and family risk and resilience guidebook with its resources and assessments? Why did we even create this in the first place? And I had alluded to the quest for the answer to why suicide, but it led us along the way to realize that there was no one place where there was a compilation of tools that move beyond, for example, the very good work that places like Michigan State have put together around stress, but moves beyond that to put a more comprehensive, integrative set of materials together. And we know that farms and their families and the ranchers and their families and their workers are under a lot of stress. They have been, they probably will continue to be. And as we've said before, we believe that we have to have this coordinated approach to build resilient farms. And that if you're going to do that, you have to have some decision tools and educational tools. And these we thought needed to be made available to you in an easy to access format. That you needed these valid assessment tools, and that Extension and other professionals, like the health professionals I've mentioned, may have developed some tools that can be used. And already Linda put up a checklist from USDA in the chat box and gave the link there. It's a live link. You can go right to that list. So we know there are things that exist. It's not that everything needs to be created, and we don't think the system should spend time creating that which already exists. We can use each other's things. Our time, we think, ought to be spent then after we use them and saying how effective were they, and or creating things that don't exist. Now, I started out by saying that they experience a lot of stress. This next slide is going to reinforce why understanding the stress load is so important. And to do that, I've used an illustration of wagons receiving bales of hay. And probably most of you have seen this at some point or other. And you start out with a wagon that is structurally sound, waiting to receive things that come on it. And for right now, the bales represent stress. And those begin to be added. And eventually, you're carrying almost more than a full load. We certainly are seeing that with the healthcare workers who are trying to cope with COVID-19. They have things piled upon them. And what does that result in often? It results in something like this. You can't carry it any longer, and it falls apart. You have some sort of accident, potentially injury, damage to the system, and that, of course, is the big worry right now with the whole healthcare system under such stress for ordinary healthcare and extraordinary healthcare in the time of the COVID-19 crisis. Back to farming. Farming ranks in the top 10 most stressful. Just stay on there, please, if you will. Most stressful occupations in the United States. In 2017, the Star Tribune in Minnesota put out a poll that they had some 600 people that are in agriculture or who support people in agriculture respond to. And basically, they asked them with a set of questions what things they were seeing among the people they were serving. And right now that was 3 years ago. That list came out, and I've been using it, and some of my colleagues have been using it when we have public gatherings to talk about this, and continually financial worries ends up at the top as an indicator. Anxiety, concerns about farm transfers, burnout, depression, marital difficulties, alcohol, drug, and gambling addiction are all identified by people out there in the field as being indicators that something is wrong. And you may have been seeing this. And we got Meg saying that she did the study that the Star Tribune reported, and she'd be glad to give more information and data. Thank you for that, Meg. I usually use it to get responses. We're not going to do that today, but I say these are indicators. Now, what do these indicators, what underlies, what's behind, what's the impact when you begin to see some of this? And that's where our extensive review of literature really played out. And one of the first things I was struck by in that literature was a study that showed that when farmers and ranchers were under stress, their ability to make a sound decision was inhibited. And so was their ability to adopt agricultural practices that might even be beneficial to them going through the stress or the crisis, but they are so overwhelmed they can't learn that from you. And you may be wanting to teach them, but they may not be in a position to learn. We know that physical and mental chronic health problems among the family members also contribute to how well you can operate your business, as does depression, anxiety, despair, and yes, ultimately, for some, the choice of suicide. The literature is pretty clear about the relationship between stress and injuries. Injury rates go up. Young people see behaviors, practices that aren't in the best interest of safety, and they start replicating those, and a cycle begins of people getting injured, their health is impacted, and so is the business. Addictions here, I mentioned earlier from that study, addictions, people are turning to self-medicate, and I just saw sales are up on alcohol online as we go through this, but they also, because of the injury list, many of them are being given a medication that becomes addictive. And we know from a study released by the Farm Bureau National last year, a study they commissioned, that 75% of farmers say they have easy access to that kind of thing. Well, there's many other indicators of the negative downside of stressors, including for some the concern about losing their farm as a business, and this may be rising to the forefront for some now. Another thing that I want to point out, because of the work we've done in the area of health insurance, there are many farmers who one or the other of the farmers or the ranchers work off the farm, and they have two major reasons for that: income and insurance. Right now, we're seeing people being laid off, which may mean they don't get their insurance. And so there is a need, again, to come back and help people understand what are your options and how you pay for that. In a study that I was involved with, 75% of all farmers said the number one risk management tool they need is health insurance. So with that little added commentary, we're going to move on to one more slide, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. And that slide says that, again, we found that things seem to aggregate around health and well-being, financial management, personal and family resilience. And Maria is going to take you through looking at a whole series of tools. Maria, take it away.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that you'll find in the guide is we organized information under those three areas. And under the three areas, meaning health and well-being, finance, and sort of personal and family resilience or development, we've identified some assessment tools and some resources. And so I have the challenge of trying to introduce you very quickly to some of those resources. And so I'm going to start with the assessment tools. And the next couple of slides just really kind of outline why assessment tools are so important. And I think as extension professionals, we tend to know this. But certainly for programming, it helps us identify key audiences, their skill levels, trying to figure out what they need, what kinds of activities would be helpful for them, understanding their level in making change or how to make a change. You know, that helps get the attention of some of our more technically focused farmers. Helps us to maybe differentiate how we do programming for men and women, or maybe even folks of different nationalities. Helps us conduct some assessments, and then maybe even identify some gaps between what the educators are planning and what our learners need and want. Next slide. So for the learner, you know, assessment tools can really be used to sort of do self-assessments, and we're going to highlight one of those in a few minutes. And it can also help them measure some change over time. Maybe I've increased my confidence in this time period, and now I'm so confident I can actually make a behavior change. It can help us communicate, right? We can use some of the data that we collect to help us ask for money, to help improve understanding by decision makers, maybe even to report out and get program accountability for funds that we've acquired. And then lastly, around adult education. And so it can help us figure out people's learning styles or their preferences, or maybe even do some assessment around what personal and family values are impacting their decision-making and or their resilience areas. So my next slide really is a listing of 6 of the assessment tools that we've identified. The How Healthy is Your Farm, and linking farm vitality and family health and wealth is kind of a 13 Likert scale questionnaire that people kind of begin to think about how the stability of their farm, for example, and their health, sort of helping to underscore that linkage, and some strategies they can use to strengthen their farm vitality by paying attention to their personal health. Other tools are these that are listed, right? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a financial wellness scale. Barb O'Neill out of New Jersey, she has a whole set of personal finance assessment tools. Oklahoma Farm and Ranch Financial Stress Tool. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but in the guide itself, we have these titles, a short description, and the way to connect, the URL typically to connect to those assessments. Next slide. So the next bunch of slides that I think for time reasons I'm going to have to go through fairly quickly are kind of broken down by our topic areas: health and well-being, financial, and the individual and family resilience or personal development. And so here are some examples of the program tools. The way they are organized in the guide is by target audience. So in this case, for example, under health and wellness, for individuals and families of farmers, there are here are just 3 of the many identified resources. The Smart Choice, Smart Use health insurance programs, we had to put that one in. The Resilient Farms, Resilient Minds Guide that Michigan State University worked on, and that whole managing farm stress resources that they have. And then the Linking Farm Vitality and Health Community Forums. This is a resource that will be coming shortly, but it's really the how-to guide for how to host a Linking Farm Vitality and Health Forum in your community or state. Next slide. So here's the next kind of target audience, right? From the farm business perspective, what are some health and well-being tools that are out there? So we have this stacking game or activity that gets people to really think about how do you develop and build a strong farm. And we've got these, you can see this picture here of the Jenga tiles with words on them of different characteristics of that help to build a strong farm. And so this is an activity we created. The directions for which are in the guide and on the website. We have some thriving farm visuals, and we have this video that we're going to highlight a little bit in a second. And then there's some things that have been developed by other people, like the Resilient Farms Financial and Management Guide and the Weathering the Storm material from Michigan in terms of cultivating a productive mindset. Next slide. So here is a snippet of this How Healthy is Your Farm video. So, you know, I thought playing the whole video would be helpful because one of the things I found as an extension educator trying to support kind of the risk management programming happening in my state is a lot of farmers, you know, aren't paying attention to their health and are not thinking about sort of that human capital as from their own perspective, thinking about that from their own sense of health and well-being. So we're hoping to plant the seed that that is an important part of that human capital component as you're managing risk on the farm. So, of course, Linda, that would be awesome to include it on the Beginning Farmer newsletter website. And so this is that assessment tool. We have this, the visuals that kind of go along with that stacking game that can maybe help illustrate, you know, how that Jenga game and those blocks can really illustrate the need for all of those key pieces to really keep the farm strong. So next slide. So there's certainly those wonderful resources that have come out of Michigan. They are excellent and are great at addressing that stress piece and helping people to think about managing stress and their financial resources well, because they realize it's important to address finances as a stressor. Okay. So lastly, in this area is the professional and stakeholders. And so again, these are resources that we can use to actually be doing professional development for other people or resources that can help us as we're trying to pull together programming for other people, other professionals, and our stakeholders. And so again, here's a list of resources that are listed in the guide with a lot more information. Next slide. And there's some of the online pieces. Next slide. So the next area, right, is financial management. And so again, we wanted you all to be aware that there are other resources within cooperative extension. Your family and consumer science and financial management colleagues are there to help. And many of the programs that are listed in the guide are ones that could be offered through or by your colleagues, as well as through the Financial Security for All community practice. And here are just some of the programs that are offered. Next slide. On the farm business side, we know many of you are involved with Annie's project, with the Extension Risk Management Education Center and all the wonderful resources on there. The family, making family business decisions, and the workbook for ranch transition when you aren't in control. So again, these are excellent resources that are listed in the guide. Next. I think here, there are some resources that can help bring additional information into your programming. Certainly for professional development, there is the National Association of Personal Financial Advisors and the Association for Financial Counselors, Planners, and Educators. They can be great for speakers and referrals. There are ways to go on their websites and find local people who may be able to help. Next slide. On the resilience development side, programming tools, again, there are some self-assessments as well as some programming that can be used that have been developed for farm audiences, but also for non-farm audiences. But again, they are designed in such a way that can really help no matter what, whether you're a farm audience or not. Next slide. These two pieces we found that really spoke to resilience for the farm And so one of them actually is a PowerPoint presentation by Bernie Irvin, and the other is this wonderful a checklist for farm business management skills. Next slide. This came out just over the last couple of weeks, but that whole Fostering Resilience in a Time of Crisis put out by the Journal of Ag, Food Systems and Community Development. And so again, this is another resource that is available to help support us at the professional development and stakeholder level. Next. There we go. So farm stressors, farm family stresses, private problem, public issue. That is a brief that is listed. We have the National Extension Relationship and Marriage Education Network. Again, they can help with some of that personal and relationship development, and then the building resilience and reducing risk, what youth need from families and communities to succeed. That's a non-extension resource, but an excellent resource that can really help us begin to integrate things around personal and family development into our programming. Next.
Now we move into the question of how can we integrate risk and resilience strategies into program planning. And so within the guide, there's a tool, and it's based upon the socio-ecological model. So I don't need to touch on the socio-ecological model. That was covered earlier. But again, you can look over here on the right-hand side of your screen. You know, where are these points? Where are we trying to make an impact within our planning? And so it could be individual, interpersonal, farm, community, organizational, policy. So you could, you know, this is set up in the manner of you could check the box. And then, this kind of pulls the tool all together. So first you're defining what the issue or problem is that you're trying to address. What will success look like? And then what are the factors? So what are the risk factors associated with it? What are the resilience factors associated with it? Going back into that area of each of the levels of the model. And then it moves into, okay, so who's your target audience? What are the outcomes you're trying to address? How will those outcomes be assessed? So you write your assessment tool in there. What are your teaching tools? Who are you going to partner with? What's your timeline? And who's responsible for what? So you can you use this tool as a comprehensive approach to addressing farm risk and resiliency. So it's a great tool that's in the guide that you can use. And again, you can base your program planning off of the socio-ecological model. And so where do you start? You need to consider the value of resiliency thinking in your programming. How can you use this in your programming? On the same lines, you can broaden your understanding of resilience and resiliency programming and farm families. Discuss with colleagues and use your support network there, using your peers. Expand that network. And then we always want to use research-based or informed theory-driven strategies. And that's what the guide has done for you, is it's pulled all this information together in one place. So where do you start? You need to connect your work to the farm risk and resiliency model, use the strategies and tools, work with others to develop an organizational and community practices, policies, and collaborations, and then experiment, learn, and share what you've gathered.
Thank you for that. We hope that all of you say, well, how can I get organized? These tools right here might help you to do that, to have the conversations you need to begin thinking, tie it back to the logic models, go into the guidebook and read a little bit more about the theories and so forth, and of course, explore all the tools. As we move on into the final part of this, I would remind you that I have placed in the chat a live web link. You should be able to copy and paste that in, and you'll be good to go immediately here as we end this webinar. So we are coming to the near end, and the question starts to be that we need to ask ourselves is, to what extent can we should we, will we act? What will we, should we, what can we do to reduce risk and resilience of farmers, farm families, farmers, and communities, and the same for the ranching community? What will we do? And we can't do it all, but we can do something individually and collectively. We should begin to see some changes made if we commit to this and commit to it over time and to learning how effective what we do is. So that is an important question for you. And if all we did was fill up an hour and a half of your time with information and nothing happens from it, then this will not have been an effective webinar. We need each one of you to think seriously about what you can and will and should do. We're amazed that we had 260 people on here today. There's still 242 with us, and we're coming into the last little stretch of this. We thank you so much for that. Now, many times throughout today in the chat box, you ask, where's the toolkit? How do I get access to a particular tool? So Jesse puts the next visual up there. This is what, if you go to the University of Delaware website, you will find something called the Farm and Farm Family Risk and Resilience Toolkit. And the first thing listed there is the guide that I particularly talked about. Then there's some of the visuals and the video and the stacking game and things like that that Maria went through, the logic models that Jesse shared with you, and the planning tool that Jesse shared. We also anticipate as we create more things. For example, we now have a placemat that you can use, and we have the bingo game. This toolkit should be growing. And that brings me to why we think it will grow, and that's the next slide. We think it will grow into a second edition because of the generosity of you on this webinar today and others. Some of you already inserted resources or offered yourself up to talk about something today. So there may be other resources that you're aware of that we didn't mention, of course, and are not in the guide. So check out the guide first to see if it's there. And if you know of something that is out there and or you have used, if there is something that you have created but it hasn't gotten out there yet, or something that you're testing, we would like to know about that. And I'm going to take on the responsibility of receiving your emails and or your questions, but let's start with the email because we could always talk if you wanted to do that afterwards. And we will begin to build a greater and greater toolkit and resource for the system to use going forward. We don't see that any of this work as being exclusive to us. We see it will take all of us working together. So we welcome that. And yes, someone just asked, is the Zoom being recorded? Yes, it is, and it will be made available, and I assume being sent to you since you registered so that you'll know when it's up there. Amanda, thank you for your compliment. So that's the comment section. People feel free to continue to post your comments, but we'd also like to know now if you have some questions, if you would like us to elaborate on anything. We are totally open to that. We're going to be watching the chat box right now and seeing what you come up with, and we'll handle this as best we can, either individually or together. So what came to your mind that you wish you had an answer to? I see some very encouraging words coming in that this will be helpful there. Laurie said this is going to be posted on the Northeast Region Risk Management Center's webpage, probably on some of the other risk management sites' webpage. We may end up with it over on with us. Appreciate your comment about the presentation. Yes, you do need to read the theories in detail and think about them individually, maybe talk with some others about them to say, To what extent have we been using these? Is this something new that we need to consider? You know, throughout my entire extension career, which is now over 40 years of being associated with extension besides 10 years of 4-H, so it's the vast majority of my life, I have heard that we should make sure that everything we do is research-based, research-informed, and theoretically driven. Yet often we don't even know what those are, where to turn to them. So we hope that what we have done is help provide that with you. Any special issues about farm families, and let me see if I can find that, and youth may be pressured to stay on the farm, stress from educational concerns and so forth. Well, that has to do with, Maria, you might want to speak up here too, but this has to do with transitioning the farming operation. And it actually goes back to, within that resilience theory of Walsh's, to taking a look at belief systems and, you know, family heritage and how much people actually all buy into the idea of keeping the operation going. You know, they may not all feel that same way. Even my husband and I left the farm and went into careers and left that behind, and then we bought ourselves a farm 10 years ago, and we're back into farming now as with a small grass-fed operation. But people may feel quite differently about how they think about careers and staying on the farm. So that's a whole set of programming that could be done.
There was an earlier question about how do you establish a sense of need to young farmers who feel indestructible?
Well, actually, there is quite a bit of work going on around young farmers. Some of them may be feeling indestructible. Maybe that's your experience. This COVID virus may help us to focus on examples of where people who thought they were indestructible turned out not to be. And you may be able to turn from those examples and ask what lessons could be drawn when it comes to beginning and young farmers. But we're also seeing from some of the research that's going on with beginning and young farmers that some of them have gotten started, and USDA is helping to support some of this work, but they're beginning to look at how feasible is this to be a viable business going forward, and at what cost and price, and I'm not just talking financial, will it take to keep our operation going? And is this the best thing for the mix of family? And of course, you start to look at generational differences on how you see things. And so many of the new and beginning farmers are in the millennial generation. A few of them are emerging from Gen X. The average age of the farming population is more in the boomer group. Even there, it's in the younger boomer group. I'm 20 years older than that average age. And so, you know, the generational differences will have an effect. And so understanding generation differences, their values, their belief systems, back to that very first Walsh theory might help you think through that. I see that Tommy has shared here that he's using some diagrams to help people think better about systems thinking. Tommy, if you get some of those created, we'd like to include them in our list. That would be very helpful because people do, by and large, tend to be very visual learners.
So here's another one.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So we have a family doctor trying to assess healthcare needs of my farming community. Do you know of any healthcare systems that are working to do health survey of their community that I could learn from?
Right now, I have to think about that. In general, there have been a number of community health assessments in fairly recent years. Some of them have been conducted by community organized groups, some by hospitals who are under a mandate to periodically check in with their community. So the first thing to do, I would think, is go look at your various hospitals in your community, get to their website, and see about their community health assessments and what already exists. Now, we have a unique situation now because what might have been there if they conducted that 3 years ago or even last year may not be as totally relevant. But lest we get only stuck on coronavirus, people are still getting ill, getting injured, and have other things that they might need. We also know already that if you're in a historically depressed community, that there are great health disparities among financial levels of our population and among ethnicities of our population and race. And already those are good indicators. In lieu of another study, you can turn to that kind of information to say, it's likely that this is what is going on. It's likely that this might happen. It's just like some of the health professionals are trying to look now at other viral things such as the Russian flu and other SARS and so forth, and to say, what did we learn from that? You can learn things from what others have done. That may not answer you totally, but that's what comes to mind immediately. Is there anything else that we really need to address right now? We are nearing the end of our time together. I think it's almost there. If you have any last minute comments, please put them in. We appreciate everything that you're saying to give us some feedback. You can still contact us, you know. We gave you our addresses. If there's any way we can support you in your thinking, if you're going through a thinking process, or with some presentations, or in whatever way, we would be glad to do that, just like we're asking you to help us to expand our resources. Maria, what's your last piece of, last statement you'd like to make before we close out?
I just want to thank everyone for participating and really encourage people to think about you know, using that program planning worksheet that will help you stay organized, and to also think about, you know, we're used to targeting one audience. How might we target the family or the, you know, community in a different way that really helps to support farmers? In a sense, that's really why we did this, right? We recognize farmers, although probably the most resilient community out there, because of their strong connections, they still need our help and support too.
And Jesse, what about for you?
You know, again, I don't have any really final thoughts other than what you two have shared. I just appreciate everyone joining us today, and I thought things went really well.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, on behalf of the three of us, we are grateful that you would come and would stay. We are particularly grateful that Lori and her colleagues, including Curtis up at Michigan State, would make possible this webinar on such a short notice. And we just look forward to hearing from you and seeing what it is you can do by taking this thinking, these tools, and make a difference out there for the folks you serve. Each of you, please, please stay well, you and those that you love and care about. And we don't know when we're all going to be physically together again, but one great thing about the extension system is we are a united system, so we're dispersed, and we've been through other things, and we're going to get through this together as well. And after all, we can learn to be resilient in the face of risk. So take care, everybody. Thank you very much. Goodbye.